foremost would like to welcome again everyone for a wonderful beginning to a conference that we've worked on quite a long time to think about, as you can see from our wonderful plenary speaker. This topic of migration has very many edges to it, and we're hoping to at least give us a bit of dimension, some food for taste. If Mario mentioned pasta, well, we're going to come out with all of the other nutrition, meat and appetizers and so on, and this is what we plan for you today. So I'm going to be very short, as I did promise Mario, and I will say just a couple of words using my position as a chair for this morning panel, first panel, to, as I said, just to mention a few points that I thought were very important that came out right, especially from our last speaker. I think that one of the key interesting points that we could think about from Alan Berson's talk is the idea that migration today has really evolved from what international relations scholars have called an issue of low politics to an issue of high politics, meaning that really migration across the board seems to be on the agenda of foreign policy, of international relations, and certainly of global politics. And as a political scientist, I found it extremely fascinating and very, very inspiring to think about the notion that policy actually might matter. I really have been, we as political scientists, academics, have spent quite a long time really asking that question. How does it matter really to influence, curtail, contain migration flows? And if so, how? These are some of the issues that we have been thinking about. But as a conference as a whole, I have to say I'm delighted by the interdisciplinary nature, the difference of stages of people thinking about migration, some academics, some practitioners, colleagues that come from the humanities, from social sciences, even from natural sciences, that really start to think about how to manage an issue of migration, which perhaps, as we were reminded, is not necessarily a new issue, but certainly an issue that is high on the political agenda. We always have to remind ourselves that migration is an old phenomenon. It's as old as man. Man has moved from its very beginning to hunt, to gain a livelihood. But it really is since the erection of the Westphalian nation state, where states were divided exclusively in their sovereignty by their so-called nations into ethno-cultural communities, that we really start to see migration emerge as a political issue, no more than in the current era, or certainly the era that began in, I would say, in the post-Cold War era, that has seemingly given a new dimension to migration control, and certainly issues that we will talk about over the next days, the new actors involved in migration, whether they are international civil actors, other states that are actors, private companies, and international actors on the scene. So these are obviously issues that many of us here care about, and I hope that we will get different voices. As for now, as for this particular panel, what we are trying to do here is to really lay out some of the comparative and historical frameworks by which we can start to think about migration and the changes, or these not so large changes that we might be looking at. And in front of us today, I would like to just introduce, for me personally, a wonderful group of people. Today we will only have 3 rather than 4 on our panel, because Mr. Ayala is not going to be with us, but we have 3 fantastic presentations, I can assure you. And one journalist that I've really been looking very forward to meeting reading. This is Sebastian Rotella. He's an award-winning journalist and author. He's a senior reporter for ProPublica, which does investigative journalism in the public interest. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Frontline PBS, and other major outlets. He covers international security, including issues such as terrorism, intelligence, migration. And during the 23 years at the LA Times, he served as bureau chief in Paris and Buenos Aires and correspondent at the Mexican border. He is the author of Twilight on the Line, Underworlds and Politics at the U.S.-Mexico Border. And his third novel, Rip Crew, will be published this March. His novel, Triple Crossing, which in fact is set at the Mexican border, was named Best Debut Crime Novel of 2011 by the New York Times Book Review. His journalism honors include a Peabody Award, Columbia University's Moore Cabot Award for Korea Latin American coverage, the German Marshall Fund's Prize for European Reporting, and the Urbino Press Award of Italy. He was the Pulitzer finalist for international reporting in 2006 and an Emmy nominee in 2012. I'm very, very, very honored to have him on our panel today, and looking forward to hearing his talk.
20 minutes. Firm. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Professor Mignone, Chancellor Rotella. It's a pleasure to speak after my dear friend Alan Burson. As you saw, it was a masterful panoramic analysis of the global situation today, and it made my job much easier. I'm going to be talking about some of the same issues, others that are different, but my presentation will be more impressionistic and anecdotal and based on my experience, as you heard, as a journalist over the past 25 years covering the southwest border and border enforcement in the U.S. and around the world. I'm going to talk about the past and present, the myths and realities of the border and border enforcement, what the border and border enforcement were like when I first started covering it, what the situation is like now, and most of all, why so much of the political debate and the press coverage is faulty and inaccurate, especially about issues like legal immigration and terrorism. Why some of the proposed measures that we hear about so much in politics today, like a border wall or refugee bans, are misguided and could even make problems worse rather than better. So you heard about my experience. I won't repeat it, but I just want to make it clear. I did spend 5 years, day in, day out, covering the Mexican border, based in the San Diego-Tijuana region, but traveling along the length of that international boundary. That means covering immigration, drug trafficking, corruption, organized crime, politics on both sides of the line. And my perspective, I learned from great sources, the migrants themselves, human rights advocates, people who study these issues on both sides of the border, and obviously the security forces, which is essential. In fact, in my career, in which I spent a great deal of time covering law enforcement all over the world, probably the single police force that I spent the most time with day in, day out, riding around with them, is the U.S. Border Patrol, which is a fascinating law enforcement agency. And in fact, the protagonist of my novels is a Border Patrol agent and then a former Border Patrol agent as the stories go on. And I've continued to visit and cover borders and cover this issue around the world in Central America, South America, and in the European experience, particularly in Italy and Greece. I say that because I think it's important as part of the premise of this talk that this is an issue I know well, but I try to be very careful how I talk about it and what I say and how I write about it, and be humble about all there is that is left to learn. This is not an easy issue. That is not easy terrain to get to know well, even when you spend time based there covering it day in, day out. And that's why I find it disconcerting and unfortunate that the political and media debate about these issues is that a lot of prominent, powerful people talk about this issue with very strong opinions that have great impact on our society and our laws and our reality, often without benefit or seemingly without benefit of facts and frontline experience. So as a result, there are strong opinions on this issue and a series of myths have grown up that have always sort of circulated in this discussion and that persist today that are particularly vociferous. And what are some of those myths? I mean, the bottom line one is that you still hear, either directly or implied all the time, is that the border, the Mexican border, is out of control, right? That was the premise of our presidential election, our political debate. It didn't start with the last presidential election, but it was. We hear that illegal immigrants are flooding across our borders. We hear that most illegal immigrants are Mexicans, that most illegal immigrants are dangerous criminals, that terrorists are flooding across our borders, that it's easy for a terrorist to enter the United States, posing as refugees or through other means, and that the solution is, for example, to build a giant wall or to ban entire classes of people. As you may have noticed, a lot of those myths tend to be on one side of the political spectrum. There are myths on the other side too, and obviously those are problematic. I mean, there are times when people talk about the border and border enforcement as if it were systematically or inherently abusive and racist, and as if there were, you know, systematic human rights abuse at the U.S.-Mexico border, or that enforcement in that sense has that sense to it, and I think that's also unfair and inaccurate. But getting back to those myths I outlined, which can be summed up by this idea that the border is out of control, you saw Alan Burson showed you the numbers, but I can tell you from experience, I know the border isn't out of control because when I covered it in the early 1990s, it was much closer to being out of control. It wasn't out of control then either, but it was certainly closer when you compare it. You saw some of the images. We're talking about, at its peak, more than 1 million arrests a year at the border, hundreds of thousands of arrests every year at the border. And most of those, in the period I was covering, were concentrated in the San Diego-Tijuana corridor, which is in a 16-mile stretch of border from the Pacific Ocean to the mountains. So imagine that. You had and then immigration then was overwhelmingly Mexican, and what the smugglers and the migrants did was focus on that corridor, because you basically had from Tijuana all the way up to Los Angeles continuous urban sprawl in which it was easy to move. You could watch people cross the border illegally back in those days. You could go down to the border and find the right spot, and you could see it happening in the daylight. One of the most remarkable images that struck me, and it was one of the most powerful images I've ever seen, was that the I-5 freeway in San Diego, and those last miles going from downtown San Diego to the border, was probably one of the only highways in the Western world, in the developed world, where you could see dozens of pedestrians walking on the freeway in the center median, because the migrants, what they would do, the illegal immigrants would cross and they would make their way to the freeway and walk north on the center median, because the thinking was, and it was true, the Border Patrol, there was only so much they were going to do to try to arrest them, since there were these cars speeding at 70, 80 miles an hour in either direction. And as you can imagine, there were dozens and dozens of deaths and injuries, and it was a tragic, incredible sight to see, you know, people, entire families running across that freeway. But that image summed it up to me. Another image that summed it up that you may have seen was what the Border Patrol used to call banzai runs, and the migrants I would talk to, the smugglers, called them Viva Villas, which was in honor of Pancho Villa, but they were basically, people would organize mass charges where they would start on the Mexican side and run up the freeway and sort of just rush through the defenses. There was a lot of conflict, a lot of tension, a lot of violence back then, particularly on the Tijuana River levee, where you would have great crowds of migrants and smugglers and people, border denizens, gathering every night, facing off with Border Patrol agents. There were often riots, there were shootings, there were rock-throwing incidents, there were vehicle rundowns, there were brawls, there was a lot of crime, with the migrants always as the victims, abuse by corrupt law enforcement, particularly on the Mexican side, but also by the Border Patrol, which was under-financed, under-resourced, and overwhelmed. Imagine, you saw those numbers. At the time, the Border Patrol, there were only 4,000, about 4,000 Border Patrol agents. Now we're talking up to 18,000. So when people talk about the border being out of control, look at the way it's changed. And there were so many different ways in which this chaos manifested itself. Among others, there was a lot of cross-border crime. Another singular moment during that period was when, covering a complicated face-off between Mexican police forces in Tijuana, the Mexican state police and the Mexican federal police. There was an arrest by Mexicans of a Mexican official in Tijuana, and journalists rushed to the scene because there was almost a shootout between the two rival Mexican police forces. And the federal police drove away in a caravan, you know, the guys with AK-47s and in a caravan of Jeep Cherokees and Chevrolet Suburbans, taking away a high-ranking official who they had accused of corruption. All those Jeep Cherokees and Chevrolet Suburbans had California American license plates. So we took pictures of them and called the San Diego police, and sure enough, the great majority of those cars had been stolen in the United States and were being driven by the Mexican federal police, who hadn't even bothered to change the license plates and who were deeply involved in the theft. There was an industry of auto theft run largely by the Mexican security forces at the time. And as a congressman, San Diego congressman said at the time, I think all of us who wanted to encourage free trade across the border didn't mean this kind of free trade. But so that was what the mood was like. What happened? Alan Burson laid it out. There was a series of operations, you know, an increasing political pressure for reform. So there was resources, operations, famously Operation Gatekeeper in San Diego, Hold the Line in El Paso, where the defenses were built up. After 9/11, there was a fundamental moment where border defenses were beefed up at the Mexican border and throughout the United States. And there was the 2008 economic crisis in the United States, which also had a great impact on reducing Mexican immigration. And as you heard, profound changes, economic and demographic, in Mexico that reduced Mexican immigration. And when you go to the border now, and when I go to the border now, with those images I just described to you, that panorama in my mind, what I see is incredible. Another thing that you have to remember, back then it was so easy to get back and cross the border. It was dangerous, but people did it. People would go, many Mexican families would go back every year. So you had people would go home for Christmas, often bringing things home to their villages, to their families. And illegal crossing and arrest would spike through January, February, March, April as people would return. That kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. Again, the Mexican flow, though you never hear it or you don't hear it enough in political discourse and the news, is down basically to zero. It's become this Central American phenomenon, but with much lower numbers, because it's very hard to cross the border now. It's expensive, it's dangerous. It's not a game. It never was, but it's not the way it used to be. And in fact, as you heard, a lot of what crossers do now is surrender themselves to the Border Patrol and not try to elude them. And I've spent time in the past few years trying to chart the evolution to a Central American phenomenon, and having visited the border of Mexico and Guatemala and spent time doing stories, particularly in Guatemala. It's remarkable how the southern Mexican border, the border of Mexico and Guatemala, has become the new front line, as you heard, and where most US-bound migrants come to first, and how profound that is. But I think one thing that's important to remember, obviously that new illegal immigration to the United States is driven by poverty in Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. But just as the immigration from those countries in the 80s was conflict migration, people fleeing from incredibly abusive regimes and from wars, very violent wars, in interviewing people along that line and people in Central America, what's also clear is that this is a new kind of conflict migration, which is driven, a lot of it, by crime and fear of crime, and by gangs, and by young people in particular trying to get away from that, you know, because they can't go to school, they can't function in their neighborhoods. And I think that's something to remember as we think about solutions. So why is it then that people, political candidates, pundits, people on TV, people in the media still talk with such irresponsibility and impunity when they talk about the border and talk about it being out of control and talking about incredible measures that need to be taken, as if all those things that I've been trying to describe and that Alan Burson described hadn't happened? It's politically, I guess, you know, wins points to talk like that, and it also perhaps represents a greater fear or insecurity about our loss of control about many things of culture, economy, society, and jobs. And there are still legitimate problems and legitimate dangers, but it's clear when you talk about something like a wall that it's a bad idea, it's overkill, it's too expensive, it's not necessary. There's already fencing and technology in key corridors, and there's more all the time. As you heard, we don't need a wall in open land. I think the talk about building a wall was not unlike, since we're near New York, all of you know how New York City has evolved, how bad crime used to be in New York in the 80s and 90s, and how it's now one of the safest, perhaps the safest big city in America. Talking about building a wall now is kind of like saying, because there is still crime in New York and people still suffer from crime, that we need to bring in martial law and the National Guard. I mean, it's just, it's not a relevant or intelligent solution. It's disconnected from reality. There are things that can be done, I think, to better border enforcement or better the situation at the border. Certainly technology, certainly the immigration court system. This is not a politically sexy thing to talk about, but one thing that's going to fix the problem is when the immigration courts are beefed up and get resources, and a lot of these problems with asylum and backlog and people claiming asylum, being arrested, and their cases languishing in the system, that could be changed by beefing up the immigration courts. I also think research could be well spent, since we've had this incredible and overly, very rapid, frenetic buildup at the border at times, that screening of who we hire is very important, who become Border Patrol agents, who become border agents, because a lot of crossing, particularly as open land crossing has become more difficult, a lot of crossing now depends on sophisticated organized criminal organizations and corruption, not just on the south side, but at the border on the US side, right? So that's another thing that we need to be careful of, is that, particularly with drug smuggling, but also with people smuggling, that using our resources as we build up this edifice of defenses to make sure that it functions humanely, effectively, and cleanly is vital. And cooperation with Mexico is vital. As you heard, Mexico has changed, in a lot of ways, and I think we have to be very stern on Mexico. There's still a problem of corruption. There's still a problem of abuse. I was always struck by, even Mexican officials would admit to me that often, at the times back in the day when you had migrants caught between, migrants fleeing and they were caught between Mexican law enforcement and US law enforcement, they would choose to surrender to US law enforcement. But that's going to, and I think aid to Central America is vital in a way we could use our resources. Don't forget, those are 3 small countries, Honduras, Salvador, and Guatemala. Those are countries where resources, if well used, could do a lot. And particularly because, again, it's a question of those resources, I think, could be used particularly on questions of not just of, obviously, of economic aid, but also of rule of law and policing and human rights and building up effective justice systems. Guatemala, for example, has seen quite a bit of improvement because that's been an area that it's been a forerunner in, with a special UN prosecutor's office that is supported by the United States and the international community and goes after systematic corruption and goes after crime and has improved the security forces and has brought down the former president and vice president of Guatemala on corruption charges. And I think that's that kind of focus on relatively small countries, those 3 countries, could have a great impact at our borders and on our immigration problem. But the other big issue that people talk about a great deal with some irresponsibility when it comes to borders is terrorism. Here do not pose a threat, and of course no system is going to be 100% effective. But the reality is that the vetting that takes place for people that are either visiting the United States or certainly those seeking to come here as refugees is extremely rigorous and careful. And that's a message we send not just to our allies but to our enemies, that we are not, in fact, at war with Islam, and I think it serves our interest from a national security perspective. These people can come, they're going to be screened, they're particularly going to be screened if they're from certain countries in the world where terrorism is a problem. But this idea that we need extreme vetting because it's not extreme, there's always things that can be improved, but let's not forget how much is already being done now. I'm being told I'm coming to the end, so that works out perfectly. Of course, there are mistakes, people slip through, but the bottom line is that radicalization in the United States, radicalization in Muslim communities, is at a far lower level than it is in Europe. I've been covering this issue in Europe intensely, Islamic extremism, for many years, and particularly the past couple of years I've been back at it. I was based there in the early 2000s, and I see the difference. And in just about every country in Europe, I'd say Italy and Spain less so, but just about every country in Europe, has this problem, even though they have different approaches to integrating their immigrants and their Muslim communities. The French approach is sterner, the British approach might be more multicultural, the Scandinavians is more welcoming. But they all have problems, big and small countries, with very high, in some cases unprecedented levels of radicalization. We don't have that. We don't have a criminal class that is blurring into an extremist class, which is happening to some extent in the cities of France and Belgium, which is very alarming. Crime blurring into terrorism. We don't have in the United States, we don't have neighborhoods, we don't have Muslim communities with codes of silence and vast support networks where things can happen like what happened after the Paris attacks. If you remember, the surviving plotters involved in the Paris attacks of 2015 took refuge in their own neighborhoods in Brussels and were able to remain underground and not captured for 4 months, and then carried out a bombing at the Brussels airport, despite an incredible manhunt both on the ground and by US and British high-tech surveillance. We don't have that in the United States because we are good, something we are good at. We have our problems and it's imperfect, but we're good at integrating immigrants and we're good at integrating our Muslim communities. So that's why the idea, the talk of a Muslim ban, and then the new iterations of that, of bans on certain countries and all that, is a dangerous phenomenon, and the tone is particularly dangerous because, for one thing, it's also hypocritical because it's very selective. There are certain countries like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan that have been excluded from that ban that, in my view, are some of the real hubs of Islamic extremism. And all that anti-Muslim rhetoric that has been generated could help create a problem that we don't have here in the United States at a serious level. It could create resentment, suspicion, and radicalization in US Muslim communities. That doesn't mean we shouldn't focus on those communities when we're looking for Islamic extremists. That's obvious. But we have to be careful because it would be counterproductive and foolish to send a hostile message, not just to our US Muslim community, but to the hundreds of millions of Muslims around the world. We're a welcoming country and we're good at it and we should be proud of it. We should be vigilant, but we should be welcoming. In summing up, the two fundamental lessons I've learned from covering this issue over the years are: one, a great sympathy for migrants and refugees, for their stories, for their courage, for their talent. They're the best, often, and the brightest of their societies. And also a certainty that effective border enforcement is a necessity, because not only if it doesn't happen can there be the kind of problems we've seen in terms of crime and terrorism, but also because of the backlash that we're seeing in places like Europe where border enforcement has been a real problem, and the populist wave here as well. So border enforcement has to be smart and effective, but it also has to be reasonable and humane. It has to be based on the realities of the present, not the myths of the past. Thank you very much.
Wonderful talk, and we're going to wait for the end for questions. We'll try to leave a few minutes to the end